blurs out the background?
Unfortunately, not that I'm aware of. And we are live. Welcome to the Unconscious Bias and Venture Capital session. I'm Kelly O'Connell, and I'm the managing partner at 360 Venture Collective. 360 Venture Collective is an emerging venture firm that invests in historically underestimated founders building tech-enabled impact products. I'm really excited to be joined by three incredible panelists today who will be joining in a conversation that's very near and dear to me about how unconscious bias appears in venture capital and about what we as industry members can do to create change around it, as well as why we should create change around it. That said, I'm going to pass it over to our guests and allow them to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit more about their backgrounds, beginning with you, Joey.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelly. And it's just wanted to say a huge thanks to Start Out for putting together this equity summit. Thank you for inviting me as well. My name is Joey Mack. I am the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Chicago Blend. We are focused on advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in Chicago's venture ecosystem. We were founded back in 2018 by a group of local VCs who were really concerned about the severe lack of representation here in the city, particularly of women, non-binary, people of color in the venture industry. So thus Chicago Blend formed, and I joined about a year and a half ago. The way that our main areas of work, there are really three. One is just around data. So we measure and publish diversity data, just measuring diversity across the venture ecosystem here in Chicago. Our second area is focused on talent. So we have a venture fellowship program to provide underrepresented, aspiring VCs an opportunity to break into venture. And then our third area of focus is around education and resources, which we deploy through workshops, events, as well as published content.
Thank you, Joey. Really excited to hear your contribution to today's conversation. Over to you, Miriam.
Great, thanks, Kelly, and thanks to Start Out for having me speak on this really important discussion around unconscious bias. So I'm Miriam Hawk, the executive director of Venture Forward, and a lot of what we do is similar to Joey and Chicago Blend, but we do it on a national scale. So we are affiliated with the National Venture Capital Association, which many of you may know and is very focused on public policy and advocacy, whereas Venture Forward is focused on increasing the diversity and the inclusiveness of this industry, specifically looking at the investor base, because we know that's where a lot of the capital and the power and decision-making lies. And we also approach diversity through an intersectional lens and recognize that there are multiple facets to diversity that are important when thinking about initiatives and programs. We have a few main areas that we focus on. One is through a program called VC University that we run with UC Berkeley and has had about 2,000 participants come through the past 3 years. We host a program called LP Office Hours, which is helping to connect emerging managers from underrepresented backgrounds with LPs. And then similar to Joey and the data that they focus on at the Chicago level, we run a survey every 2 years called the VC Human Capital Survey, which is how we're holding ourselves accountable as an organization and how we think the industry should be holding itself accountable when it comes to really seeing what progress is or isn't being made and helping us better identify where some of those challenges and opportunities are.
Thank you so much, Miriam. It's clear that you're going to be able to contribute from a data-driven place as well as from your personal experience to today's conversation. And now I'm excited to have Ian introduce himself.
Hi there, Kelly, and great to be on this panel with some really impressive people. I'm excited to learn as much from everyone else on the panel and the audience as contributing here. So great. My background is twofold. One, a serial entrepreneur, fortunate to have 4 startups, which 3 were acquired at M&A and 1 I took public. And then after that, in the last really 5 years or so, I've been helping emerging managers basically get started. So helping them raise their fund, particularly their first fund, a second fund, and that's working with them, working with LPs, family offices, and I've done a bunch of work with the startup community, helping really increase diversity amongst the the cohort of new fund managers. So excited to bring some insights on that to the table.
Well, today's conversation is going to bring together these three incredible panelists to talk about this important conversation around unconscious bias. But we also have you attending in the audience live. We have a Q&A. We want to encourage you to share your questions using that Q&A feature. As we're talking about this, utilize the chat. Tell us what brought you to this talk. Tell us about what interests you about VC and this topic, and allow us to be able to respond live to some of your questions as well. So feel free to engage with these incredible panelists while they're here. Creating conversations around a topic like this is one of the many reasons I'm happy to contribute as a volunteer with the Start Out community. Start Out is an important organization, and I serve as a co-chair for the Virtual Investor Committee. And that's part of the hat that I wear as the moderator for today's session. That said, I think it's really important to begin the conversation by asking the question of the panelists, what is unconscious bias and how does it relate to the VC industry? Joey, I'm going to come to you first.
Sure, and I think I might be having some connectivity issues, so my apologies if I drop off again. For this question of what is unconscious bias, at least here at Chicago Blend, for us, it is the set of assumptions, attitudes, beliefs that one person might have about another person based on certain traits, such as race or gender, sexual orientation. Humans have a remarkable to how we learn and how we make sense of the world. And from an evolutionary standpoint, it has been incredibly helpful. It taught us things of, which certain things we can't eat, which certain sounds we need to avoid, which predators we need to avoid. And with repetition and reinforcement, that pattern recognition, which is a form of unconscious bias, becomes hardwired. This unconscious bias, this bias towards pattern recognition, though, becomes a problem certainly in modern society, especially as we're thinking about things like hiring, who we work with, who we want to deploy capital to. And I think that's kind of, how we try to understand and recognize that all of us come to any table, to any conversation with our own kind of hardwired biases that are informed by our own life experiences. But I think what is really important, not only in venture capital, but certainly in all facets of business and in any industry, is being able to understand where those biases might creep in so that we can set them aside and try to make more objective decisions around whatever it is we may have to decide, whether it's who to hire, who to fund, et cetera. I know later we're going to talk a little bit more about how unconscious bias appears in the ecosystem, so maybe I'll pause there, but happy to elaborate if that's helpful.
Thanks, Joey. Miriam, is there anything you'd like to add on that question?
I think Joey covered it really well. I would just to add that I think where unconscious bias sort of boils down to, it relates to stereotypes that we all have and we pick up as we live and have so many different life experiences. And everyone has it. These are mental shortcuts we use every day for everything, in the work setting, at home, in every interaction really that we have. And it manifests in a lot of different ways. There are a lot of different types of biases that sort of fall under this unconscious bias. I think there's been some really great literature out there, but some of the main ones that we see creep into the venture ecosystem, and Joey hit on some of these: gender bias, which is a stereotype associated with different genders. There's also an interesting one that's related to name bias, and that's where we might screen out or prefer a name on a resume or a name of a founder based on an ethnicity or race that it might be associated with. And then there's affinity bias, which is how we tend to favor people who share similar interests as us, backgrounds, education, experiences, and we just tend to be more comfortable around people who are like us. And so that inherently does lead to an industry that is then just going to be less diverse. And so that is, I think, really the main crux of the issue. And I think has led to this sort of blind spot that the industry has had when it kind of comes to just the opportunity for innovation. And maybe the last thing I would say around this is it is important to recognize that unconscious bias exists, and I know a lot of firms have done trainings on this, but it really can't stop there. Like doing an unconscious bias training is really not the solution to addressing unconscious bias, and I think we'll get into it a bit more. But I do hear that sometimes from firms that say that they're doing that, and I'm sorry, that's just not enough. Like you have to really do more to address it.
Thanks so much for that, Miriam. I'm nodding along as both of you are answering, and I know Ian, as a VC, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic, and then maybe if you can transition us into a little bit about how unconscious bias does appear in the ecosystem from your perspective, that would be really great.
Yeah, I think Joey and Miriam did a great job in setting the description of it. I think that it seems to be some of this is almost learned, and some of it's inbuilt, and we unfortunately keep on learning some unconscious biases throughout our life, and particularly when you get into your career. So, and then in terms of how it seems to impact. At its heart, really, venture is a pattern recognition, and I think Joey and I talked about that point, and it's identifying patterns with a view that having had success with one approach, it will repeat itself. Now that has been proven to be successful, and a number of venture capitalists talk a lot about that as their approach, but then we also know that there is increasingly there are new types of firms being created which are using data-driven approaches to find opportunities. So I think that if we look at the first part though, which is like how VCs use pattern recognition, it comes I think from the hiring of someone in the first place. To be a venture capitalist, if you're a general partner, hire someone, or what do you look for? That's one piece where the unconscious bias come in. It can also come in from the point of view there you are looking to go and raise your fund, and you need to get limited partners or family offices. They have their own biases to be able to understand that. And then let's say you now raised your fund, and then it's a matter of then choosing who to invest in, and then subsequently then after the investment, and then who to have decisions around the company itself, the portfolio, the CEO, the board decisions, and then also who to have as co-investors, and then also points around decisions around exiting investment. These are all decision points. Right? At a decision point, the multiple factors can drive the thinking, unconsciously or consciously. So those are just some of the areas we can touch on, everything from the employment to finding investors to actually operationally doing the venture work.
Powerful entry into this conversation between these three answers, talking about the way unconscious bias is part of our nature, to the intentional actions we need to take to recognize and then react to those biases. I'm going to ask Miriam for you to also weigh in on this topic of how unconscious bias appears in the ecosystem, working with a national organization, providing education. I think that's a really important lens to have that conversation from.
Yeah, I think a few places where I would highlight are the fact that the industry has a lot of subjectivity when it comes to decision making, and excuse me, there isn't a lot of objectivity. If you think about how you make hiring decisions, it's looking at track record, but it takes years to really develop a track record. So you're kind of going on, gut or falling on these biases. Similarly, if you're evaluating a founder at a really early stage, there aren't metrics, or there's likely not a lot of data that you can really pull from. So again, you're sort of having to fall on these other ways that you're bringing subjectivity into the decision-making process. So there have been some interesting studies around this. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Harvard Business School, the Harvard Business School's case study with Heidi Roizen, where one of the business school professors, presented the same exact case study with Heidi's name and then with Howard's name, and the perception of those two investors, the same exact story, but just, excuse me, based on their name. there was, different perceptions there. And similarly, like there have been studies where you're looking at a resume and, the names are different that might be referenced to a different gender, but the details are exactly the same. So I think being able to identify where this subjectivity creeps into the decision-making process and trying to bring more objectivity into the process is something that we try to advocate for and encourage firms to do. And part of that is really around just having some of that data to make it more of a known decision versus just kind of guessing.
Really important. Joey, I'm going to come to you asking the same question about how unconscious bias appears in the ecosystem, and also start to think about why does it matter as we're talking about this.
Absolutely. And I think Miriam did a really great job kind of teeing that up. And I'll just make a quick plug. We at Chicago Blend reference Venture Forward's data all the time just to kind of benchmark Chicago against what the rest of the nation looks like. So I'll just plus one the importance of having good and consistent data collected regularly. So in terms of how it appears in the ecosystem, it appears in a number of ways, but I think the three ways that we often hear about it from the stakeholders that we work with, both VCs as well as founders, as well as people trying to get into VC, I think there are three areas. Funding selection process. So from the perspective of the founder, what is their journey in terms of trying to raise capital? And when, just as an example, I was in a meeting earlier, and when you hear the different stories of, women or non-binary folks who are raising capital and the struggles that they encounter, the types of questions that are different than their male counterparts get, it's really shocking. I mean, it's not that shocking when you data, but it's still quite jarring. Something we hear about all the time from founders is that women tend to be evaluated based on their track record. Men tend to be evaluated based on their potential. Those are very different things that you're looking at, and they're two very different standards. So from a funding selection process, I think that's one of the clearer ones, at least as it relates to founders. The other is just around hiring, not only among investment teams at VC firms, but also among portfolio companies too. And if you start with a portfolio company, oftentimes a company, they will look to their investors, to their funders for help filling really critical roles, whether they need a CTO or a CFO, whatever the case may be. But if their funders are have generally homogenous networks, you're going to end up with someone who is probably not underrepresented. And those hiring decisions that a company makes in its early days, especially at the most senior levels, those will have ripple effects in terms of how that team will grow and what the composition of that team, what it'll look like as the company grows and scales. And then finally, again, just around hiring within a VC firm, unconscious bias, it can appear not only as it relates to like endowed traits like skin color or gender, whatever the case may be, but also in other ways too. I talked to a firm very recently and they're very blunt. Look, we do not look at candidates who don't come from an Ivy League school. They recruit from about 4 or 5 schools. And when you do that, you are immediately limiting the pool of candidates, and you're potentially selecting out a lot of really good candidates who might bring a different perspective to your investment team. So those are just some of the ways that unconscious bias appears, at least from our perspective here in Chicago. And then I'll just provide one more example. Is we had the privilege of co-hosting an event during Pride Month, and we did it with the Chicago chapter of Startout. It was a great event, and one of our panelists, she's a trans woman, founder, CEO, building a great med device company, but she shared a story where she was ready to, she had lined up an investor who was ready to sign on the dotted line, and they were going to bring another investor in, but then when they found out that she's trans, they pulled out, and their reasoning was that's a cultural issue and we just don't want to deal with that. But otherwise they were ready. The business was good. It was sound. They were ready to move forward. So when you hear stories like that, I think that's just another way of how unconscious bias is appearing in the venture ecosystem, at least here in Chicago.
There are so many incredible points that Joey just shared. Ian, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to pull out one of the elements, Joey, you mentioned, which is about the homogenous nature of the LPs. And so, Ian, as a VC, I'd love to look at why unconscious bias matters, and particularly from the lens of and how it interacts with our perception around fiduciary duty as VCs, because I think that's one of the areas I've observed that becomes problematic in terms of funding decisions, is this idea of trying to perform as a fund, particularly emerging funds. So coming to you, Ian, why does unconscious bias matter? And if you can speak to how it impacts your role or how the perception of supporting a homogenous LP base might impact it, that would be great.
Sure. And just to clarify, I'm not a venture capitalist myself. We help emerging managers get their fund started. So we're not ourselves actively making investments, but we're more helping emerging managers. So, but I can address it because we spend a lot of time with limited partners. And so most funds, when they start off, very few of them actually receive money from institutional sources of capital. Most startup, fund ones are your own network, family offices, and groups like that. And it's normally after you've got performance, then you're already seeing the institutional investors come in, and so I think that. One positive thing is that the sheer amount of capital, now that may be changing the next, starting to happen now, probably next 12 months or so will continue, but that has the last maybe 4 or 5 years been a tremendous amount of capital that's been looking for yield and has sought out the venture as an asset class. And so you've seen a lot of new emerging managers get funded, precursor ventures, rare breed. These are all great minority-owned venture funds, and they're done really well. And the great thing about them is it's like almost in the same way that we look for selection. There's unbiased section. We ourselves, if you are an emerging entrepreneur, you should also be looking out, for those who want to break the mold, and some of these people like Precursor are really impressive what they've done. So, and then in terms of the other funds, if you're looking at like a fund 2, fund 3, fund 4, where they are starting to bring in institutional, I think that the challenge is that institutional investors, LPs, that there hasn't been as much pressure on them to have a diversity. I mean, look at the pressure has been on venture. I mean, you can throw a stone out the window and hit another report on the lack of diversity in venture, but there's less of it around LPs. I think that's a great area to focus on, and I think it'd be good to for people to think about how do we educate institutional investors, pension funds, etc., to think more broadly, because they have a very important sway in funds 2, 3, and beyond. But I think there's the other opportunity is working with family offices in Fund 1 who have an oversized impact on sourcing and providing capital to emerging managers.
Thank you very much for that, Ian. Miriam, I'm going to come to you and ask exactly the same question, as I think it's such an important topic. Why does unconscious bias matter, and particularly as it relates to the VC industry?
So the venture industry is at its core really trying to invest and grow innovation and grow the innovation economy, and is all about disrupting industries, creating new technologies. And I think if the industry is continuously funding the same people who have these same shared experiences, come from very similar backgrounds, I feel like it is a huge missed opportunity for an LP or a VC who is looking to drive returns and invest in the next big thing that's going to be the next huge company, big unicorn exit. And I think that's where it's really this this financial incentive here to really address and identify unconscious bias, and then really think about how to remove it where possible. And so I think that firms that are starting to prioritize that and really understand it, I think are going to be the ones who come out at the other end of this with some strong funding decisions and hiring decisions, because they have really thought about it. I think that's like a big area that we focus on. I also think the other reason why this matters is if we're looking at the stats and we're seeing just this, like Ian said, the same data diversity stats that we continue to see, it's like thinking about diversity. It's not just like the good thing to do, it really is the smart thing to do. And so I think really having sort of that being a fiduciary investor and having those fiduciary duties to think about, are you just investing in the same types of technologies or the same types of firms, when we see actually looking at the data that first-time funds and emerging managers have done really well from just the pure returns perspective. And if that's going to continue to get overlooked by LPs, that's a missed opportunity for the LPs too.
Thanks so much for that perspective.
I just want to jump in there and say, I think it's a performance thing. I think it's if performance is shown by having a diverse set of individuals at the venture level or at the fund level, then it's actually is the most important thing, because we all want to find great companies that build fantastic products that solve real problems. So it's like, how do we do that most effectively? How do we leverage the full talent that we have in society? And that's, I think, that's why it's so important. It's leveraging talent and ensuring that we don't miss great talent. Yeah.
And maybe just to relate it to that, I mean, there have been several stories where an all-male investing team has missed out on opportunities for really amazing consumer products that were geared with the audience of women consumers. And so I think like that's those are specific examples where we've seen unconscious bias and the lack of diversity really hurt those investment decisions, where those companies actually went on to do really well, but because there was this unconscious bias creep, it was a missed opportunity for those specific investors, just purely based on gender and not recognizing this opportunity for women consumers.
One of the best.
Sorry, just a quick question. Sorry, interesting, Miriam. Do you know what happened to that fund? Did they get additional LP support? That'd be really interesting to see. If they were dinged because they didn't have that selection. That
I don't know which specific firms these were. These were ones that, and I think I've heard some some female founders kind of talk about it in more general terms, not naming which firms those were. But my sense is those were well-established name brand firms that kind of missed out on that.
Right. Sorry, Jerry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to reinforce the point. I think the one of the best things and most succinct things I've heard about this topic was from a Black woman GP, one of the few here in Chicago. And the way she said it was, one firm's ignorance is my opportunity to make money because I understand markets in other ways that they don't. So, while like we at Chicago Blend, we think representation matters, period, and equity matters, we do know that there is a real opportunity cost to not diversifying who is looking at different market opportunities, who's looking at companies, who's sourcing companies, and who's getting invested in.
And Joey, I think that's such a great point for us to spend a moment on, the opportunity cost of continuing to overlook problems that are venture scale based on who we're providing funding to. And so when I think about why unconscious bias matters in VC, it matters because we're innovating with a bias towards solving problems from a very specific lens. And when we that lens by allowing the innovators to have a different life perspective, have different patterns that they've experienced and observed, we begin to solve for a larger total attainable market, and we begin to solve for underserved market in a way that hasn't historically happened. And so I know For our fund at 360 Venture Collective, we often refer to it as an intentionally inclusive investment thesis. So we are selectively investing in historically underestimated founders because we believe that's profitable and purpose-driven. We believe that creates an opportunity to solve for pent-up market demand, frankly, by allowing for that. But I think that we are not the only ones in the industry that are responding to this. There's a shift that's happening in terms of recognition. Today, we're on a panel where we're talking about unconscious bias in VC. 10 years ago, I don't know that this panel would be taking place. And so I think that there is a powerful shift that's beginning to happen, in part driven by the reality that VC is an asset class, and there is a very acknowledged health and wealth equity divide. And so I know that that's one thing that drives me to disrupt this aspect of the industry, to create opportunities for both LPs and founders that haven't been there based on how wealth has previously been distributed. And so I'll ask, coming over back to you, Miriam, to start, how have you seen the industry respond to this topic? And what's positive that our audience can maybe think about as it relates to this topic?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that we're seeing a lot more firms that are adopting or implementing unconscious bias training, and I think that is a good start. And like I said earlier, it can't be the only way or the only thing that firms can do to address this, but I do think that is a good start to kind of go through that training, because I think it's important to really start at the basics, but then to come up with an action plan that would make sense for the firm. I know every firm is different, but some examples of things that we've seen firms do. One is when they are looking to hire, to not just send it out, the jobs back out to people at their alma mater or within their networks, but to post it publicly and to get broader reach, and to make sure that maybe people not in their network have this opportunity to apply and to be considered as a candidate. Other examples that we've seen are firms that are working directly with organizations like Venture Forward, or with others that have a strong pool of talent coming from underrepresented backgrounds, and just for a firm to recognize, like, hey, we are seeking more underrepresented talent to join our team. We don't have those networks. How can we go find those networks? And so working with organizations like Venture Forward, I know a lot of firms have been working with like Black VC as well on this. And then I think the other aspect that I think some firms are doing a better job maybe than others on is to just start collecting data. Collect data on, how many founders have you met with this month or this week? And just take a look, like, are they all of the same gender? Are they all of the same race? Are they all go to the same school? And just start collecting that data and being able to see, well, one, if you're trying to improve it, I think you just have to have that data to track it and measure it over time. But then two, to really figure out, like, okay, yes, we're speaking with too many people, or meeting with too many people from this background. We need to make a conscious effort. We need to be intentional about, trying to maybe reach other demographics to broaden our network. So those are, I think, some examples that we've seen some firms doing a good job of really just trying to bring more of the objectivity and just sort of the data aspect to this.
Thanks so much, Miriam. Joey, I'm going to come to you, and certainly you can talk about the perspective of how the industry is responding, but I also want to acknowledge an audience question that I think is related. And the question is, do you think fear has been a factor in how funding has been distributed, or in some of the unconscious behavior remaining? And then how can we promote and publish? The audience question was LGBT success stories, but I'll just broaden it and say success stories more broadly to help mitigate that risk.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and this is, I'm going to give more of an anecdotal answer because I don't have hard data around this. I do think fear does come into paths. Maybe they just don't understand a certain sector, a certain space, a certain part of the market, and as a result, they'll default to the, what has worked well for them in the past. Again, kind of going back to that pattern recognition issue. That said, I think a lot of it, just truthfully, just being brutally honest, is just more ignorance or lack of interest. I have talked with to many GPs, many folks working who, they do express some of that trepidation. And I think that's okay, to admit like, hey, I'm maybe wading into a space that I don't know. I do think that things like education, things like having success stories, people who have been in that role and have, learned different ways to either source different companies or different opportunities to hire or source from different talent pools. I do think that's helpful in terms of bringing more people along. So fear for my perspective is seldom can be a helpful motivator. I don't know that it is in this case. I think a lot of it is maybe just lack of understanding. To the first part of the question, though, of how the industry is responding, and I'll try to keep it quick. I think it depends on kind of where you sit. So, I think some LPs, at least here in the Chicago, Illinois area, are starting to ask more questions around DEI, around ESG, and other things that kind of, beyond just what the financial returns are. And I think, there are a number of reasons for that, but LPs obviously have a lot of influence with fund managers, so that has been encouraging. Agree with everything that Miriam said around the data collection, regardless of whether you're an LP, a GP, or founder, that is absolutely critical. And the other thing that I think is really interesting that we've observed is just more intentionality around recruiting partnerships. Miriam mentioned Black VC and a couple others, but it's also establishing those partnerships who have access to talent that you don't normally work with, establishing those partnerships even before you have a job that you're hiring for, because it takes time to build these relationships, to understand, what organizations or what different, universities or whatever the case may be, what type of talent pool they're working with. But as you get to know those folks more, then, when you are ready to hire, it's much easier to go back to them and say, hey, we're hiring now, we're hiring en masse, please send this to your network. And I think that applies whether you're hiring for a VC firm or for a at a portfolio company. And then the last thing I'll mention is in terms of boards of directors, which I don't think get enough attention. And I realize, especially with portfolio companies, a lot of the boards are kind of, preset based on, who the investors are. But advisory boards are also a really great way, especially for portfolio companies, to bring different perspectives to the table. And even though they may not have an independent board seat, they are able to kind of, help, perhaps assuage some of the fears that you might have, or help educate you in different ways as you are trying to figure out how to grow and scale this company. So those are just some of the industry responding here in Illinois.
Thanks so much for that, Joey. Ian, I'm going to come to you with exactly the same question. How have you seen industry respond, and how can we amplify these success stories so the industry at large starts to see that momentum?
Sure, and I'll maybe use analogy as a positive example of how I think the industry has adapted, and hopefully as maybe a model what could be done. So you may recall about 10, 15 years ago, there was this like, if I'm a VC, I'm not going to invest in anything more than 50 miles away from the center of Palo Alto. That was it. And it was like, the thinking was that unless I can drive to someone, I won't be able to see them, know them, and investing in companies in the Midwest, etc., was too far. I don't understand that, and maybe they don't have the sort of the profile that would be the right fit. And the last basically 5 or 10 years, that's completely changed. So you now see firms setting up offices in across the whole US. In fact, funds dedicated for those particular areas, and they've had support from the government to go and set up operations in these areas. And as a result, we've seen a flourishing of amazing companies, from across the US, areas which were deprived, areas which were rural, and no one didn't think there was an opportunity to find great technology. It's there. And those companies who invested in those, who went out there, invested in those companies, made a return, now have a far better story to demonstrate than those who stayed, in their 15-mile radius in Silicon Valley. So I think that is a positive story of how the industry did adapt, learned, and I suppose you can now say that that was worked through. Now what we'd like to do is apply the same rigor in terms of how do we go after the talent of people there and get and I think that's the next one. If we're able to do it successfully, breaking down geography. Now it's like, let's break down our own perception. So that's, I think, the next one. And then I think the one area I've seen a success that we've talked about, Black VC, there's All Raise, which has done a great job to women. And then, of course, here we are, Startup, great in terms of raising the profile. Literally the last 3 years I've been working with Startup, it's gone from focusing on entrepreneurs to now like looking at the venture community and LPs. It's really started to like have that breadth of understanding and helping educate people in the community that it's not just, you're not just this one step. There's multiple parties to this ecosystem, and it's educating them, having, as Startup does, people from different backgrounds on the board of Startup, on bringing this team together here. So I'm generally positive to where we're moving towards. Just wish it was faster.
I think that's such a wonderful transition. We're nearing the end of our time together. Today's session has gone too fast. And this is certainly a complex topic. There was a Q&A question asked about, do you think this primarily happens at the screening stage? And I think to answer that, I'll share, I think that today we've heard that unconscious bias can appear at every stage, from who's funding, to who gets funded, to who's hiring, to who's represented, to who's having these conversations and what topics are discussed. I'm going to ask each of the panelists with our last 3 minutes, if you could have one ask of the many people to help move this conversation forward. What would your ask of the audience be to help eliminate unconscious bias from VC? And Miriam, I'll come to you first.
I know I talked about data a lot, so I'll maybe pick a different answer, but I do think data is really important. The other one is we spent a lot of time talking about the D of DE&I and just bringing in the talent, but I think there's a lot of importance that also needs to be placed on the I, especially around inclusion. So once you have made that hire, or once you have invested in that underrepresented founder, like how are we as an ecosystem, and how are we as an organization fostering that success and growth and opportunity to really help that entrepreneur or investor succeed? I think the inclusion aspect shouldn't be missed as part of this broader conversation.
Thanks, Miriam. Joey.
Yeah, I think, regardless of whether you're a VC, LP, founder, or just someone who's interested in this space, and I think someone in the comments said this too, but I think sharing your stories is really important, a really successful experience, investing in a founder of color, did you have a really great hire who was a woman, at your VC firm? Those things should be celebrated. They should be talked about. And the more that they're talked about and celebrated, then I think the more we start to normalize that and start to cut down at that, the unconscious bias. I know you only asked for one, but the last thing I'll say is, if you're a VC, something that we always ask, post your open positions publicly and make everyone go through the same screening process. That will be super helpful in terms of diversifying your team. Thanks.
Thank you, Joey. Ian.
A very quick one. I'd say if you're a decision maker, be curious. Try and understand more about the people around us, because you may find that there's a lot more talent under the hood than first blush. So keep being curious.
Well, this has been an incredible session. Thank you to our very engaged audience and chat for your many questions. Thank you to each of the panelists for spending your time here, sharing your expertise. If any of you are open to it, please share your socials so people know how to get in touch with you within the chat. Thank you to Start Out for hosting this session, and Martina for helping to navigate the chat. behind the scenes. Thank you all for your interest in helping to evolve the industry. This is really incredible.
Thank you.